So we added our tabs and our drawers, but what we mostly did this far is we went forward. I showed you how to go to new pages, obviously because that is an important part. But sometimes you also need to go back programmatically, so not just through that back button, which is added automatically, but because something happened. And sometimes you also need to pass some data back to the previous page. Let's imagine here, when we're on the recipe detail page, we want to have a button that actually allows us to delete this recipe, not permanently, but only such that we go back and in that list of recipes, we don't see it anymore. Maybe because we were in a list with a couple of recipes, we checked out this one, we didn't like it, and we want to go back, but we don't want to see this one for now. When we then go back and go back here, we would see it again. But temporarily, I want to get rid of it. Of course, that's a bit of a made-up use case, but it's a good use case for showing how you can go back manually in code and how you can pass data around. So for that, on the recipe detail or on the meal detail screen here, let's make sure that we have some button to go back and delete this recipe. And I think a floating action button is a good fit here. So I'll add a floating action button, a new floating action button widget therefore. And as a child, I'll just set an icon here, the delete icon, this trash bin here. And when we now press this button, so on press, that's the interesting part. There, I want to go back. Now you can go back with the help of the navigator, and there not with push, but with pop. Now we also saw pop before in the course. And of course you need to use off context here, by the way. We saw pop before in the course to close our modal bottom sheet, for example. Pop removes screens that are on top of the stack, and things like dialogues or this modal bottom sheet are behind the scenes also managed as screens, only though they only make up a part of the overall device screen. But still they are treated as overlays to the current page and therefore can be popped off to remove them. And the same is true for entire screens like we have them here. So pop removes a screen. If I just call it like this, watch what happens when I click this floating action button, I'm taken back. That happens. So it's the same as if the user would press this back button here, or on Android, this back button down there. Pop can be very useful if you have something in your code that requires you to go back or to remove a dialog or some other overlay from the screen in code. Now besides pop here, you also have pop and push named, which does just what it says. It pops the current page off and thereafter it pushes a new named page. You also can check with can pop whether there actually is a page to pop. For example, if you navigated to a page with push replacement, then you replaced the existing page in the stack and therefore popping the new page wouldn't be possible because there would be no page to go to. Right? Because you replaced the existing page. So running can pop to check whether you actually can go back before you do call pop might be a good idea if you're not sure whether you have another page in your app. Here we of course can be sure and therefore we can call pop like that. So this takes us back, but what if I now want to exclude that recipe we're coming from in my meals overview here after going back? For that we can also pass some data to pop. Passing data is optional, but here you can pass any data you want. A map, a list, a string, a number, an object, whatever you want. And here I want to pass my meal ID here. So down there I will forward meal ID, or backward, so to say, meal ID to the page we're coming from. Now on the page we're coming from, the question now of course is, how do I get that information? Well, the place where we pushed this page, this meal detail screen, is the meal item. There we have select meal and there I have navigator off, push named. This push named method led to the meal detail screen being displayed. Now this push named method returns a so-called future. I mentioned futures earlier in the course already. Futures are objects that allow you to specify a function that should execute once they're done with a certain operation. And one such possible operation, in this case it is the operation at hand, is displaying the page you're going to. So meal detail screen is the page that is displayed when push named is done. Now once the user goes back from meal detail screen, push named is fully done with its operation, because then it has not just displayed that screen, but the screen is now also not needed anymore. So the future returned by push named lets you know once the page that you push to is not displayed anymore. So you can add then here to get that result this page you are coming from gives you. So if you're passing any result to the pop method, as we're doing it here, then you get that result here in the function you passed to then, and for now I'll just print it. And that's really important because whoops, no arrow here. That's really important because it's easy to think that this function here is executed once you reached the new page, right? Because you push a named page, and then once this pushing is done and once you see the page, this function executes. But that's wrong. Instead, you push a page, and when this page is popped, then this function here is executed, and then therefore you get the result that might have been passed to pop. So for now, I'm just printing that result. Let's see whether that works. If I go here to my spaghetti and I click this trash icon, we're popping, and indeed here I see M1, which was the ID of that meal. If I go to the spaghetti and I use this back button here, then I see null, because that still triggered this function. We did pop after all. Using the back button does nothing else than use navigator of context pop. But of course there no data is passed along. So now here we would have to find out whether we have a non-null value. And if we do, then I want to remove that meal from that list of meals that is displayed. The problem with that, of course, is that I'm here in the meal item. The solution can be that in the meal item, in the constructor, I get one extra argument, which is required. And I want to bind this to a variable, a property here, which is of type function. And that's the remove item function. And I bind to remove item here. And now I can call remove item down there if result is not null. So if result is not equal to null, then I know I have an ID of an item I want to remove, and then we can call remove item and forward result, which will be that ID. Now remove item is a function I expect to get in the meal item. So in the category meal screen where we set up that meal item widget, we now have to pass such a function. And that of course means we first of all have to create one. Now it's a stateless widget, which will be a problem because now I suddenly want to change its state. I want to change the meals which I display. So let's first of all convert this into a stateful widget with the refactoring tool here. And then here in the state class, we can add a new function which returns nothing, but which I'll name remove meal, where I expect to get a meal ID. And then here I want to update my meals and remove a meal with that ID from the list. For that, first of all, we have to make sure that we don't derive our meals here in the build method, but actually a bit earlier. And init state sounds like a great place for that. That's a perfect use case for init state, because when this page gets loaded, when that state gets created, then we want to load all meals that are based on the ID of the category we're getting. So all that code here for deriving our meals can be cut out of the build method and be moved here into init state. One important thing, however, is of course that I now need to add a couple of properties here. A string property category title, which is mutable, so which is not final, and a list of meals, which are my category or my displayed meals here. And for that, we need to import the meal model. So let's import meal.dart from the models folder. With these two properties added, here where I derive my category title, I do this without final so that we actually use this property and store the value there. And here for category meals, instead, here I'll set my displayed meals with the same logic as before. We don't need to call set state here because this will automatically run before build runs the first time. And now we'll load the data when this component or when this widget is created. And we can therefore now also manipulate our data and update the user interface because we're in a stateful widget now. So here with remove meal, I'll call set state. And I now want to remove an item from displayed meals. So I'll reach out to the displayed meals here and then use remove where, which will remove all items that fit or match a certain criteria. And that will get a function that runs on every item in displayed meals. And there I check if meal.id is equal to the meal ID I got. And if it's equal, then this item will be removed. Whoops, like this. It's in set state, so displayed meals will update, or it will update, but this will also update the view. And now here, instead of using category meals in all these places, we just use displayed meals. Now we can also forward a reference of remove meal of that function we added here to meal item. So there we have that remove item argument it expects, and there I pass a reference, a pointer at underscore remove meal. If we do a full restart, because we turned this into a stateful widget that typically requires a full restart, let's go here, and now we get a problem. The problem is that this call here, which I'm doing here with modal route off, is not liked in init state because this taps into this behind the scenes context setup with the inherited widget and so on, all this behind the scenes wire up work. And this does not work here because context generally is thankfully a property that's globally available in our state object, but not inside of init state, because init state runs too early. It runs before our widget has been created or fully created and before we have a context for our widget. So at this point of time, I can't retrieve my route data, unfortunately. Now, what's the solution for that, or how can we work around that? There is another lifecycle hook, which I haven't mentioned before, and that's did change dependencies. You don't use that often, but here it's really useful because this will be triggered essentially whenever the references of the state change, which also means it will be called when the widget that belongs to the state has been fully initialized and we can tap into context. This will still run before build runs. So in here, I can now put my code which I had in init state. Init state would have been great if we wouldn't have required to use modal route off context in here. So any off context stuff which you need to do in here will unfortunately not work. But in did change dependencies, it should work. So now if we do a full restart, this looks way better. And we go here into quick and easy. This looks better. And now if I delete this here, still there. Reason for that is that did change dependencies runs a couple of times after the initialization of that state. That's the difference to init state, of course. It runs whenever the dependencies of this state change, and that's also the case when the attached widget changes, which unfortunately is the case when we call set state here. So the state we set here, where we do delete a meal, is basically overwritten when did change dependencies runs again, and we basically load all meals again. A way around that is to simply leave a little mark that tells us that we are done initializing. So here we can add a bool, loaded init data, and initially that's false. Of course, therefore we don't have to use bool here, we can use var here. And here at the end, I will set loaded init data equal to true. And now here, before we run that code, I'll check if loaded init data is equal to false, or actually the shortcut for that You could use that, but the shortcut is that you simply add an exclamation mark in front of this. So if this is false, if we haven't loaded the initial data yet, then I will run this code. So I'll move all of that, including my change here, to true inside of this if statement. And therefore, this code will now really only run for the first time. So with that, if we now do a full reload, we should have the behavior we want. This app reloads now. And then here, when we go to your recipe and we clear it, you see it's now gone from that list. If we do the same for Toast Hawaii, that's also gone. If I go back and then go again back to Quick and Easy, they are all back here, because once we click the back button here on our list of meals, this page is totally dumped and removed and the state object is cleared therefore, and hence the next time we click on a category and go back into the list of meals, a brand new page, a brand new widget, and a brand new state object is created, and therefore we again start with load init data set to false. So that whole load init data part and did change dependencies is a little bit of overhead we had to add here for this specific use case where we depend on the ID we get through modal route of context. The core takeaway, nonetheless, is that you can pass data around when you're popping by passing the data you want to pass back to the pop method, and then you can retrieve it with the then method on push named or push or whatever you used. And the function here runs not when you're done pushing, but when you're done with that page you pushed to. So when that page you pushed to is removed. That's really important. So a lot of work here, but I find it important to also understand how you can pass data back and use that data. And the additional knowledge of did change dependencies and how to initialize your data in a stateful widget, that also can't hurt.